think here we are.
Yep.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Baumer Conversations here at the Knowlton School at The Ohio State University. My name is Bernadette Hanlon, and I'm an Associate Professor of City and Region Planning here at the Knowlton School. And I am really delighted and thrilled to be able to have a conversation and listen to the research of our expert tonight, Dr. Willow Lung-Amam. Before I kind of get into introducing Willow to everyone, let me just say a little bit about how this evening is going to proceed, how our conversation is going to go. First, Dr. Lung-Amam is going to give us a 20 to 25 minute talk, and then she and I are going to engage in a conversation together. And then we're going to open it up to you, the audience, to see if you have any questions or comments that you might want to make. So you're able to do this in the comment section on the YouTube channel. So please subscribe and do that if you have questions. Assistant Professor Yaz Motiyama has kindly offered he's in our City and Regional Planning Program, he's kindly offered to feed these questions to Willow this evening. So please feel free to post some questions. So let me introduce Dr. Lung-Amam. Willow Lung-Amam is a associate professor of urban studies and planning at the University of Maryland in College Park. She is also a community director of community development at the National Center for Smart Growth at College Park. And she was recently made a fellow for the Brookings Institution, which is quite an accomplishment and something I want to congratulate her on tonight. So on that achievement, it's wonderful. Willow also holds a PhD in landscape architecture and environmental planning at the University of California, Berkeley. And she has a master's in urban studies and planning at the University of Maryland in College Park. And she also has a Bachelor's of Science in Comparative Studies and Race and Ethnicity at Stanford University. As I may have mentioned, Willow and myself have crossed paths over the years. It's been wonderful to kind of watch and engage in some of her research. We have very similar research interests. Willow's research is focused on urban and suburban policies and planning as it relates to issues of social inequality, particularly in neighborhoods that are undergoing kind of rapid racial and economic change. She has written extensively on topics related to suburban poverty, racial segregation, immigration, and gentrification, and then the politics of redevelopment, some of the things that I've also been interested in more recently. And she has, some of this work is in a really wonderful book of hers that I recommend to everybody called Trespassers. It's Asian Americans and the Battle for Suburbia, which was published by the University of California Press in 2017. So tonight I'm delighted because Willow is now going to talk a little bit about her current book project that she's working on, which I'm really excited to hear about. And this book is, preliminary title is The Right to Suburbia, Redevelopment and Resistance on the Urban Edge. And so I'm really excited to hear what Willow's going to talk about and engage in a conversation with her afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to turn you over to Dr. Willow Lung-Amam. Thank you, Willow.
Thank you so much, Bernadette. It is such an honor to be here with you because I think we've had many conversations over the years, but never so formally. So this should be a fun night for us to engage many topics conversations that I've been wanting to have with you in a virtual environment. But let's start with my presentation. So I'll go ahead and share screen and hopefully this will go smoothly. So it looks like the presentation is up. So again, I'm going to talk today, as Bernadette introduced, about my larger book project, but I'm going to focus more specifically on one chapter of the emerging book that I'm working on, which is focused on the community of Langley Park, which is largely a Latinx community in the suburbs of DC that is currently in a fight over fair redevelopment with the coming of a new light rail line known as the Purple Line. And so I'll make some connections between that and the larger framework of the book project. So the larger context in which I'm shaping this work is sort of thinking about the intersections around the suburbanization of poverty and redevelopment, and how that is bringing some of our current conversations around gentrification into new context, and particularly how it's helping to spur equitable development movements or conversations about the right to the city outside of the actual borders of the city, right, in the suburbs. This is a map of Washington, D.C. in 1980 and in 2010. And what it shows you is race by poverty. And if you look at the map on the left, which I'm sure you can't see very clearly from your vantage, but you can see a concentration of yellow dots inside the borders of Washington, D.C., which roughly surround this kind of diamond-shaped area here. And what that represents is African-American poverty inside the central city, which in 1980 is disproportionately Black and disproportionately located inside the boundaries of the city. The next map on the right is poverty by race in 2010. And what you see is that still concentrations of Black poverty in the city, pushed a little bit more to the east and east of the Anacostia River along Divide in DC, but a lot of poverty beginning to emerge outside of the borders of Washington, DC in these areas. And as you can see, this poverty is different in character than some of the inner city poverty. You see much more Hispanic or Latinx populations that represent those proportions of poverty. That is the green dots that you see on the map. So we have this radically reshaped geography of poverty in only a short period of time. This is not only Washington, D.C., but this is happening across the nation. Driven by gentrification in the city, driven by rising poverty in suburbs, foreclosure crisis, and other things driving these patterns. This is the community of Langley Park, which is where we'll be talking about today. Again, predominantly a Latinx community in an inner ring suburb just on the northeast border of Washington, D.C. As I mentioned, I'm looking at the intersection of this with the politics of redevelopment in suburbs. This is a map produced by Dan Reed, who's one of our local bloggers. This is looking at housing density across the DC region. And he asks, what are you calling suburban? Because when he looks at housing density, he classifies it as rural, suburban, and urban areas. And what he shows us is that there are many areas outside of the central city of Washington, DC that are just as dense as areas inside the Washington, DC. So when we begin to reclassify or rethink what we typically categorize as suburbs, we begin to see that there are many suburban areas inside the city and many urban areas inside our suburbs. And of course, many of our suburbs weren't originally built like this. What we've seen in the past several decades is redevelopment happening in suburbs, a more densification of suburbs, whether this be from in the Maryland area, driven in part by policies of smart growth or urban infill, or large-scale redevelopment, like it's happening in some areas like downtown Silver Spring and Wheaton, which are two other areas that I talk about in my larger book project. But as I mentioned at the beginning, this has driven many of our conversations, which typically focus on our urban centers, to the suburbs. I love this phrase by geographer Martin Phillips around these other geographies of gentrification that are typically lost in our conversations about gentrification. What you see in this slide is maps that on the left are from the National Community Reinvestment Coalition that between 2013 and 2017 found that DC had some of the most intense gentrification of any metro area across the United States. But when you look at their maps, what they show you is that, again, that gentrification has largely occurred inside the boundaries of Washington, D.C., but you also have many areas that are eligible to gentrify or have actually gentrified outside of the Washington, D.C. area as well. But this doesn't typically fit with our notions about where gentrification takes place. Now, I don't want to get into a measurement debate, but there's a lot of different ways in which you can measure gentrification. One of my students, Nick Finio, produced this map for me, which is classifying areas that have gentrified, and it just shows you some different areas outside of the borders of Washington, D.C. But the basic point is that we have many areas outside of our typical center cities that either have or are undergoing or in the future will undergo gentrification. And these areas are really important that we include in the way that we conceptualize gentrification. So in this book project that I'm working on, as Bernadette mentioned, tentatively titled The Right to Suburbia, Redevelopment and Resistance on the Urban Edge, I'm looking at the impacts of redevelopment on low-income communities of color outside of the Washington, D.C. border in its suburbs, predominantly in its inner ring suburbs, but one area that we might be able to classify as sort of in between inner and outer ring. And I'm looking at the processes and the politics of gentrification that are taking place inside of these communities and how communities are organizing to fight back, right? How are they developing a sort of equitable development politics in the DC suburbs? And I've done this through lots and lots of interviews, about 70 interviews with key stakeholders, activists, planners, policymakers, nonprofit organizations on the ground that are working with residents. About 23 of these have been in Langley Park, the community that I'll talk about today. Been doing a lot of content analysis of just looking at plans and development documents and historical archives to understand context, mapping some of the housing and business data. And in the particular community that I'll be talking about today in Langley Park, I'm also part of the Purple Line Corridor Coalition, which is a group that is actively working with residents to help to make more affordable housing available to existing residents and to keep small businesses in the community. So it's a bit of action research here as well. And my argument in the larger book project is that geography matters, right? This basic idea that if we think about gentrification and how it has been typically sort of understood as an urban phenomenon, when we move it to its suburban context, many of our notions about gentrification change. But not only the processes and the politics of gentrification, but also the context of organizing and how residents fight back and towards a right to the city, right? And so I'll talk about the ways in which some of the spatial, institutional, political, and economic structures sort of shift in the suburbs and make it more difficult in some ways for communities to organize to gain a fair redevelopment or an equitable development outcome during processes of gentrification. I have pictured here a picture from Ferguson because I think Ferguson really reminded us for the first time at a national scale that Black people, first of all, exist in inner ring suburbs, but also that suburbs have long been a space of organizing and have long been a space of resistance. It brought to mind, you know, for many people, like, where is Ferguson and why is all this happening? And it kind of showed us both the forces of decline that had moved to the suburbs as Black people moved to the suburbs, and the kind of resistance that we were seeing in these spaces as well, which is a bit of the story that I'm trying to tell. So Langley Park in the purple line. The purple line is a new light rail line that is being built currently in the Washington, D.C. suburbs. It's a 16-mile light rail line proposed to run from Bethesda in Montgomery County into Prince George's County in the Hyattsville area, New Carlton. It broke ground in 2017. It was supposed to be done by 2022, although it's hit many snags that I couldn't possibly talk about today. But it is currently undergoing some very intense politics. But importantly, this was one of the first intersuburban mass transit lines that was being proposed in the DC area. Much of our public transit system is pretty segregated and designed to, in the 1950s and 60s to bring white suburbanites into downtown for work. This is one of the first, crossing the suburbs and crossing across this critical divide between Montgomery County and Prince George's County, what the purple line has showed us is the kind of disparities that we now see in not just between cities and suburbs, but actually across suburbs. So at the bottom of this chart, you can see some of the numbers between Bethesda, Chevy Chase, where the line starts, and as we move across the Silver Spring area, International Corridor, the University of Maryland, and Riverdale. Those are the four sections highlighted here. The International Corridor, which is in yellow, is where I'm going to spend the rest of my talk talking about. But what you see is that on the Bethesda side of the line, you have a low population density, but a high employment density. You also have very high median household income and a low percentage of people that are using public transit. In other words, they don't really need the purple line to get anywhere, but the purple line needs them. People on the east side of the line need to get to Bethesda to get to work. As you move into the International Corridor, you have much higher population densities, much lower employment, and much lower median household income. The numbers here on public transit are wrong. It's actually about 25%, 1 in 4 households in Langley Park that don't have access, that rely on public transit for their commute. And so what you have is a line that can be a line that really provides access and opportunity to many of the folks on the east side of the line that currently face long commutes in order to get to their jobs and other opportunities across the region. This is a little bit about Langley Park demographics. Langley Park, as I said, is predominantly Latinx community. About 81% of the population is Hispanic. It is disproportionately male, disproportionately young, has a high average household density, many kids in Langley Park. About 70% of the population is foreign born, low education levels, high unemployment, a high number of people working in the workforce and the construction industry, a lot of day laborers, low median household incomes. Although this household income number is pretty high, I think it reflects the fact that, one, the census doesn't get very good data in communities like Langley Park, but also you have a lot of overcrowding in the households, and you have a lot of men that are living together in multiple households in one apartment unit. So the numbers on income actually goes up. So it's actually one of the lowest income in our region, but still this is well below the area median. And a lot of people still with that higher than actually probably is typical of a median household in Langley Park, still spending much more on housing than they can afford. Here's the purple line that's going to come through Langley Park, 2 stops in Langley Park. This is the red border is what is typically considered Langley Park. It's the census designated place in the planning area. And what you can see from this existing use map, this is not the planned use map, but it is a community that is very high density for suburbs, which is somewhat typical of our inner ring suburbs. They're much denser than areas further out. Almost all the area is in that brown section, and those are low-rise garden-style apartments. There's actually only 14 complexes in Langley Park that constitute 75% of households in Langley Park living in those 14 complexes. They're really large apartment complexes. And then the rest is in red, which is typical strip mall development. So these two purple lines that will be stations that will be built in Langley Park will be within a quarter-mile, half-mile walking distance of all of Langley Park. And alongside of this existing land use map, the land uses for the proposed new Langley Park is increasing densities in much of that area, in both the commercial and the residential area, and therefore creating the conditions for large-scale displacement. There are communities that are fighting back in Langley Park. These two pictures are from the Fair Redevelopment Coalition and the Purple Line Corridor Coalition. The Fair Redevelopment Coalition was started by Casa de Maryland. Casa de Maryland is one of the largest immigrant rights group in the Mid-Atlantic region, and they have their headquarters in the center of Langley Park, and have long been organizing around immigrants' rights, tenants' issues in Langley Park, and other kinds of issues. So when the Purple Line discussions began in Langley Park, they started going to some of the meetings, and they noted that people from Bethesda and Chevy Chase and these high-income areas were coming out in very large numbers to these Purple Line meetings, one, saying we don't want nor need the Purple Line, but also saying, trying to get concessions around the Purple Line development. Meanwhile, there was no one other than CASA, for the most part, attending, representing communities like Langley Park, which stood to bear the brunt of the development consequences of this new light rail line, but also stood the most to gain from redevelopment in terms of having access, reducing their commute times, actually having public transit. Currently, Langley Park sits in an area without public transit. Bethesda already has a metro station, and Langley Park has one of the highest bus ridership densities in all of the region. So Langley Park needs the Purple Line, but they only need the Purple Line if they can stay in place. So you see some of the early grassroots organizing coming out of CASA. They started the Fair Redevelopment Coalition. They began organizing other community-based groups to make sure to try to get concessions. They proposed a community benefits agreement for the Langley Park area. They were later joined by a group at the University of Maryland that I mentioned earlier, the Purple Line Corridor Coalition, which is based out of the National Center for Smart Growth Research and Education, where I am Director of Community Development, to have a more sort of grass tops connection, as I'll say, with some of the county leaders, some of the agencies at the table. And so these two groups have kind of worked together in the Langley Park area to try to get some concessions around affordable housing, small businesses. There are predominantly minority immigrant-owned small businesses in Langley Park, many of whom are already on the edge with COVID, certainly on the edge, and are really struggling to stay in place. So what they have achieved thus far is not a community benefits agreement. In fact, the counties and the state did not agree to that. But what is called a community development agreement or agreement on principles that the county is working towards. And they have made some progress on those goals. There's currently an affordable housing plan being drawn up in the corridor to preserve to put in place more affordable housing. There is some funds that have gone towards helping businesses to provide technical assistance that might allow some businesses to stay in place. There are some dollars being given to improving neighborhood spaces, but there's still a lot that is at risk, and construction for the Purple Line has already begun. So in the last several minutes of my talk, I just want to talk about some of these, the structure of Langley Park and really what is at risk and why the Langley Park area is so vulnerable to large-scale displacement because of some of its conditions. So this is the at-risk housing and small business that I mentioned. These are the garden-style apartment complexes that are so typical of Langley Park, and the typical kinds of businesses that you might see in Langley Park. As I mentioned, there's only 14 garden-style apartments. These contain the vast majority of housing in Langley Park. 75% of the community is renters and lives in one of these apartment complexes. Many of these complexes are owned by out-of-state landlords, REITs, and other shadow sort of corporations that don't have much engagement with Langley Park residents. It has some of the worst housing conditions in the county, some distressed properties in Langley Park that haven't seen renovation or any kind of any type of development in decades, and some pretty predatory practices amongst landlords. But Langley Park residents are not currently organized into tenant associations. There is one tenant association that only recently got started in Langley Park from some organizing by Casa de Maryland. Likewise, the businesses are not organized. These are some of the businesses, but there's no business associations. Again, there was attempts to sort of put together recently a small business association, but it broke down in part because there are so many different groups that make up the business owners in Langley Park, and so there was a hard time communicating amongst business owners. But I think it typifies the condition of many inner ring suburbs where you don't have tenants that are organized, where you have really large scale development that could put communities really at risk of displacement, but you don't actually have the social infrastructure or the small business infrastructure and organizing that you need, and has often been built in cities over a long period of time. You also have limited institutional and organizing capacity. This is a picture on the left of St. Camille's Church, which is a popular church just outside of the boundaries of Langley Park, and a community meeting led by Casa on the right. The quote here is from the Maryland Transit Authority, which is just saying, like, typically we would like to reach out to an organization, a neighborhood association or community association to get some engagement, but since we don't have that in Langley Park, we reach out to the churches instead, right? And St. Camille's, in fact, has been really a strong organizational partner with the Fair Redevelopment Coalition and the Purple Line Corridor Coalition because it acts as a center, a gathering place for the community. The picture on the left shows you this organizing that Casa has put on around the Fair Redevelopment Coalition and to get residents out. But because many people don't have cars, they can't easily access any kind of community meeting, even ones that Casa put on. So for this particular meeting and for others, Casa drives a van throughout the community to get residents out to meetings. And I think this kind of typifies some of the institutional constraints that you have around organizing in suburbs. I'll also say that most communities are not as lucky as Langley Park in having a big group like Casa de Maryland that's known for their organizing and for particularly for tenant organizing and immigrant rights organizing. And many communities lack any kind of nonprofit. And most of those that are there are more social serving. They've just recently moved to the suburbs as poverty has moved to the suburbs, and they're really having a hard time getting their feet just in providing basic social services, let alone responding to crises like the displacement of residents and small businesses that comes alongside gentrification. So there's really, across all my different case studies, a sort of lack of capacity at the grassroots level. And there's interjurisdictional inequalities and a lack of representation. Langley Park sits amongst 3 jurisdictions. Actually, the map on the left doesn't quite even give you a sense about who Langley Park is, because most of it sits inside Prince George's County. Some of it crosses into Montgomery County, but if you ask residents where is Langley Park, they'll show you this whole area that crosses between Prince George's and Montgomery County. So here we have all these interjurisdictional boundaries that are making it very difficult to plan for a community that is actually sitting in the midst of these things. So Montgomery County, for instance, has very different policies around affordable housing. They have a very different budget because they're a wealthier county than Prince George's. And then the other political constraint, I think, is around representation. So this is on the right is Prince George's County Council members. And as you see, most of them are African American. Prince George's County is the largest, most wealthy, predominantly African American county in the nation. Many of these folks represent outer, what I would call an exurban area, but it's just outside the Beltway communities, which tend to be more wealthy, tend to be single family home ownership areas. And the only Latina on the county council member is Denny Taveras, who is shown here. She represents the Langley Park community. It's an inner Beltway immigrant community that doesn't necessarily represent the sort of larger demographics. And the kind of problems that you see in Langley Park are not necessarily shared across the county. So when it comes to decision making, whether it's adopting rent control or inclusionary zoning in the county, you often have this fight between sort of outer Beltway communities and inner Beltway communities that don't share the same demographics in an area that is where planning happens at that county level. And then the final constraint, I would say, is the toolkit. So when we talk about how do you achieve equitable development outcomes in a gentrifying neighborhood, you often have to think about what tools you have available to you, right? So whether that be something around affordable housing, like in the Washington, D.C. area, we have TOPA, or the Tenants' Right to Purchase Act, which allows tenants to organize, if you have a tenant or association, to buy your building, right? You have a robust affordable housing fund, right? You have rent control, you have inclusionary zoning, you have all these tools in your toolkit, but they didn't just happen. They happened over organizing over decades and decades of multiple kinds of gentrification, urban renewal, slum clearance, like all these things that happened in Washington, D.C., where communities resisted and built a robust toolkit that in the midst of some of the most intense gentrification in the nation is actually coming to fore and helping these communities stay in place. You don't have that for Langley Park. So this is a report that I did with some colleagues of mine at the National Center and with CASA, just trying to imagine some of the tools of affordable housing that can be built in Langley Park, but many of which we don't actually exist. So it's a small toolkit for a very big problem. The future of the corridor is very uncertain. I mentioned at the beginning, there's some politics over the Purple Line that are currently taking place and have actually shut the Purple Line construction down right now. So you have the streets that are currently torn up and are shutting businesses down because the construction disruption. This is a picture that I took a couple months ago when I was on my way to a meeting at CASA, and the pipes from the construction just burst out into the street. Traffic was stopped for a long time. I was very late for my meeting, but it kind of illustrated the kind of disruptions that are happening to the small businesses that are already vulnerable, already on the edge, already lack the kind of access to capital that many other mainstream businesses and say a Bethesda or Chevy Chase. And now this construction is permanently in the street while the politics of the purple line are being hashed out. So in conclusion, I ask, what does it mean to move towards the right to suburbia? And I offer this quote by David Harvey, a Marxist geographer, who talks about the right to the city. The right to the city as the right to change ourselves by changing the city, which depends on the exercise of collective power to reshape the processes of urbanization. So what I'm wrestling with in the larger book project is what this means in a suburban context. What does it mean to change ourselves by changing the suburbs? And how do we collectively build power to reshape processes of suburbanization? And I'll just offer a few lessons from my discussion today, but just highlighting it over some efforts of communities to actually build power. This was CASA holding a Fair Redevelopment Coalition organizing meeting in Prince George's County at the start of the Purple Line discussions. It was actually, you see that there's not that many people there. They did it outside of their day labor center, but this was actually the first housing justice press conference event in Prince George's County history. So it was actually this monumental event. In some ways, we think about the history of the county, but it was actually not well organized. Well, I'm not saying so well organized, not well attended. And here we are trying to draw attention to issues that are happening in the suburbs that are really hard to draw attention to. So some of the lessons that I'm drawing here and that I hope will feed some of my discussion with Bernadette are some of the unique pressures and vulnerabilities that are facing disadvantaged and marginalized groups in suburbs, whether that be the kind of decline and disinvestment that we've seen in these neighborhoods, and how that sets in place the kind of large-scale redevelopment that can happen in suburbs, especially given the sort of spatial constitution of many of these suburbs. The support and capacity building that's needed, and organizing and coalition building amongst residents and small businesses, again, referring back to the fact that we don't have tenants associations, established business associations. We have very diverse populations that are just beginning to organize some of those important venues. We need to build political will and representation, and many communities often move further, faster than you're able to generate the kind of political incorporation that you need to build some of that grass tops power. And you see that in Langley Park with the representation of sort of one Latina on the county council, and the kind of the politics of the larger Prince George's County in terms of meeting the needs of this community. And finally, how do we build that more robust toolkit, given that we know that communities are already gentrifying in suburbs, but we actually don't have the tools we need yet, nor the political will to actually put some of those protections in place. Thank you so much.
Wow, I have so many questions to ask you. I'm so excited by this topic. And you've sort of touched on some of these things in the talk. And, you know, I just think, first of all, it's really wonderful to be bringing these issues of the suburbs, right? Because we sort of have, I think, still potentially this kind of image in our minds of what suburbs are and what they're like. And I think some of our policies and thoughts and planning can often kind of still hold on to this image in how we see things, right? So the suburbs are always places of opportunity. The suburbs are not very diverse. All of these things I think are highlighting and negating this kind of image, which is really, really important. And I don't want to get into the measurement issue of gentrification. I certainly don't want to go down that path. But I am kind of curious about what your thoughts are as far as the distinction, say, between gentrification in the suburbs versus gentrification in the city. And, you know, I bring this up because I remember when I first started doing some of my work on suburban decline in older suburban areas, somebody told me that suburbs can't gentrify. I mean, that gentrification can't really happen in the suburban context because they never really get that deeply declining as what you might see or what you might have seen in the kind of inner inner city, if you like, right? So I was curious about your thoughts on that. If there is sort of a distinction between the type of gentrification that you might see in the suburbs versus the city.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it is really, as I said, important to sort of put gentrification in its proper context, in which we've actually conceived gentrification primarily by looking at what's happening in urban centers, right? And there's good reason for that, right? Given the history of redlining, given the history of urban renewal, given the history of suburbs being made to be spaces of exclusion and havens for the white working and middle class, right? So there's reasons why we center the city in sort of thinking about issues of gentrification, because those are the predominant spaces where sort of migration of white middle class communities back into them has the displacing effects, has the kind of effects that we think about as associated with gentrification. But that doesn't mean that other communities can't gentrify, right? It just means that those are the predominant spaces that we think about and that actually do gentrify, right? But we have many of the same conditions now reoccurring in suburbs, particularly as you've seen Black and brown communities pushed out of center cities and into suburbs. So as gentrification took hold in Washington, D.C., you saw many Black and brown communities move first to inner ring suburbs, then further out into outer ring suburbs. And so you saw white flight, you saw the decline of their commercial base, you saw many of the same processes happening, particularly in the inner ring suburbs that you did inside the center city, which left communities like Langley Park without a strong tax base, with high poverty rates, high unemployment, all these same markers that would mean that if you have state-sponsored redevelopment, if you have a large influx of capital, if you have large influx of new populations, particularly as you're setting the conditions with the kind of redevelopment that happens with a new transit line, right? You're making the land more valuable, and therefore you're creating conditions that are going to then lead to some displacement, right? And so you have those same conditions happening in many suburbs. So suburbs can gentrify, suburbs are gentrifying, and I think there's important distinctions as you're asking your larger question, right? One is that we don't have the same kind of spatial conditions in suburbs, right? You have, in many of the other communities that I'm looking at, you have more intense like commercial gentrification happening than residential gentrification, because we don't typically have mixed use communities. So many of the kind of gentrifications that I'm looking at are really centered on commercial. It's not exactly the case in Langley Park, but in some of the other communities that I'm looking at, I think that is the case, because we do still have very segregated land uses in suburbs. We also have more consolidated land uses in some of our inner ring suburbs. And so Langley Park, for instance, used to be one farm owned by one family who in the 1950s began parceling it out and selling it to large-scale residential developers, but they only subdivided it into so many plots. So you have now 14 these apartment complex owners who own like 75% of the community, right? So you have the possibility of this large scale displacement where you have mixed ownership in smaller blocks and cities. You have, a mix of renters and owners. You don't have the same kind of conditions set for quite the same level or intensity of gentrification. At the same time, I would say there's probably a temporal element to it as well. Like I've done some work around, like looking at concentrations of poverty in suburbs. You don't see the same kind of concentrations of poverty. Many people say you don't have concentrated poverty in the suburbs. And according to our traditional thresholds of 30 and 40%, we actually haven't achieved that in the Washington, D.C. area yet in many of our suburbs. But so do we have to reach a certain poverty threshold for a community to gentrify? Do we have to, does it have to all fit within one census tract when many suburbs are actually spread, like Langley Park, across several census tracts? And so I think there is some issues of temporal and spatial measurements of how we typically think about neighborhoods and how we typically think about like the time period and intensity of development that's required in order for us to call it gentrification. And I also think you're seeing a very heavy-handed role of like county governments in underlying these policies. So in some of my other case studies, the county is really doing a lot of land assembly and other processes that are making way for these large-scale redevelopment processes that I don't think you see in quite the same way in cities all. So those are some of the things.
No, that's really interesting. I did some work on this redevelopment process in kind of the context of Baltimore, which is just down the street from DC. And I didn't know if this occurred in the kind of context of Langley Park, or is this a potential problem? But there were some subsidized housing units. There was sort of small public housing projects that were built in the kind of post-war period in some of these inner ring suburbs that the county actually really wanted to get rid of, frankly, and did do that. Sort of essentially kind of tried to, like HUD ended up selling those off to the county, and the county ended up then demolishing them and redeveloping them into mixed use, mixed income kind of developments. And I was just curious if that's happening too in the DC context. Are you seeing any subsidized?
Particularly in Prince George's County, you don't have a lot of public housing, and many people in Langley Park actually don't take advantage of Section 8 vouchers. There's a large undocumented population there, so issues of legality and access to some of those issues, those housing resources is an issue. But out of the, say, 13,000 units of housing only, and one of the lowest income suburbs in our region, you only have like 75 voucher holders or so in that community. And I think it is a larger issue with, sort of conceptualizing how do you respond to issues of gentrification when you don't actually have a lot of public housing resources available, right? You don't have a lot of subsidized housing. You don't have the kind of resources that you might have in cities that you're just trying to protect existing subsidized housing, because there's very little existing subsidized housing.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I had so many questions. But I want to give the audience a chance as well to kind of ask some things. But I'll just ask you kind of one more in terms of the. And you showed some pictures of Ferguson, and so I kind of, with the current kind of racial justice, kind of the protest movement and so on, against police violence, are you seeing something happening in the suburban context with some of the work that you've been doing in the DC area? Is there, what's the relationship, I suppose, between, say, the police and the communities that you're looking at?
Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, I'm just finishing up a community policing project in Langley Park, which was a 4-year planning and implementation project to improve public safety in Langley Park. And CASA received a grant from the U.S. Department of Justice to implement a number of different things designed to improve safety in the community, because there was a concern over safety and crime. There was also deep concerns over policing and over-policing in Langley Park. And so this was a process to sort of bring residents, landlords, nonprofits in the community together to sort of build out a plan for addressing some of those issues. And I'm just in the evaluative phase of how that is working. And my yet unwritten conclusion, so don't repeat this too broadly, is that many of the community policing stuff didn't work out that well. There's a lot of reasons why immigrant communities, Latinx communities in particular, don't trust the police, and as much as sort of resources as we pumped into trying to build some of those bridges, there wasn't a lot of movement there. But what the program did do is a lot of work in community development, sponsoring soccer leagues, helping an after-school program that happened to do gang prevention, but also happened to do a lot of other things in terms of food provision to residents. They're working on what they framed initially as a CPTED, or crime prevention through environmental design, which is very critical, which a lot of the planning and design profession are very critical of right now. But actually they did a lot of, instead I would call it placemaking work, which is sort of building out traffic areas that were high traffic, doing more planting, medians, areas where students typically gathered after school, and where the ice cream truck came through the neighborhood. They did more sort of beautification of those areas and giving residents more space to stand. Just a lot of projects that were really about fundamentally building the community capacity and its infrastructure. And so they were able to, I don't want to say defund the police and divert funds, but they were able to do a lot of that kind of work. And I think that that's an important consideration for sort of thinking about, how this movement is about more than just cities. It is about suburbs. I think the uprisings that we saw, I had a webinar that we called Suburban Uprising, just to highlight the fact that so much of the organizing that you saw and so many of the protests were not in the typical center cities that we saw, in part because Black and brown people had moved to the suburbs and were organizing where they were. So I think it was an important moment to highlight that. And I think it's an important moment to highlight, how some of the disparities that we're seeing in not only in policing, but in COVID and so many other things around the economic crisis are hitting just suburbs particularly hard.
Yeah, I'm sort of seeing a kind of future fiscal kind of crisis for a lot of these local jurisdictions. And I mean, I think in the suburban context too, this isn't so much the case in Maryland because it has a very strong county government structure, but in, where you have a lot of political fragmentation with very small local governments struggling in the future, I think it's going to be kind of a major kind of concern, I think, especially for those suburbs that are kind of struggling. You mentioned COVID, and so I just want to just quickly sort of ask a question about if the pandemic, are you seeing something happening to the gentrification process? Is it slowing down, or is there anything like that happening because of the COVID situation?
Yeah, unfortunately, Langley Park was one of the areas that was hardest hit in our region and in the state of Maryland by COVID for reasons that are not unsurprising, right? You have some of the highest rates of poverty, essential workers, overcrowding in the housing, a lack of access to health care. All of those things contributed to the high rates. And you've also seen it exacerbate evictions, which were already high in Langley Park. Actually, just I think 2 days ago, CASA did a rent strike for many of the properties that have had some of the worst landlords. And so renters literally went on strike and said, we're not paying for this housing right now. We don't have the income. CASA has been really active in bringing residents all the basic supplies that they need. What it will do to gentrification, I think, is I think still a question, but I think the larger trends across the nation are showing us that it hasn't slowed down gentrification. It's in fact accelerated evictions, which we associate with gentrification. The Washington, D.C. market hasn't slowed down almost a bit in terms of its housing prices, and you see all these businesses that were already vulnerable beginning to close. And so in some ways, it seems to be accelerating gentrification. In Langley Park, you've already seen businesses begin to close. And when we come out of this economic crisis and we have the purple line, and you've already seen mass evictions, and you've also already seen mass closures, it seems to be setting a pretty perfect storm for gentrification to only exacerbate those issues.
So I hope Yaz is still with us, and I'm wondering if there's any questions from the audience, from people who are out there watching, if they have any questions for Willow or comments that they want to make about what we've been talking about so far, please.
Yes, this is Yaz, your virtual assistant, and we got the two questions. One question is a follow-up to the Bernadette's question. Jason Rees, our faculty member, is asking, thank you. I appreciated your discussion on the need for organizing. Do you feel organizing will be stifled in the near future due to COVID? How has that changed communities' ability to organize?
What a great question. Yes, it certainly has, I think. I mean, people are hard pressed to get out there, right? So I didn't go to the rent strike that happened in Langley Park, but I did look at it online, and everybody was 6 feet apart while doing this rent strike in front of some of the complexes there. You know, I think organizing, particularly in a community like Langley Park, is really face-to-face. You know, I do a lot of work in Langley Park, and we just, and even through the grant period that we had, we just had to put a lot of things on stop. It wasn't like we could go virtual because a lot of people have internet connectivity issues. If they have a computer, then only one person in the household can use it. You know, because it's only one computer. And so, you know, in working on, you know, ongoing projects, a lot of things just really couldn't happen because they required so much face-to-face contact. That said, people are on their cell phones all the time. Facebook organizing has been very powerful for CASA as an alternative medium, because people do have phones and are using social media platforms to connect. There's a WhatsApp group that was really helpful around some of the work that we were continuing to do around sports clubs and things like that. So I think there are alternative venues that are being created in a virtual world, but we have to sort of think about what connectivity looks like in a different way, right? For communities that don't have the kind of resources of doing a completely virtual environment. So I think we need to sort of think about reimagining organizing in the context of COVID.
Thank you. The second question comes from Jennifer Clark, our another faculty member, that was section head, and she has big and long questions. So feel free to tell me to read it twice. Okay, here it is. What are the pros and cons of the community benefits agreement framework? Are these a mechanism to reassert community claims to the benefits of redevelopment, or do they simply mitigate the cost to the communities without reallocating benefits per se? In other words, should planners push CBAs or develop more disruptive tools?
Good question. Well, I'll say in Langley Park, one of the reasons why they moved away from the CBA is because they couldn't get it. A CBA is a legal tool, and you know, many developers, many municipalities are reluctant to sign into community benefits agreements because they hold them legally accountable for certain things. And so, you know, the community benefits agreements are difficult to get, but they are a good tool if communities are able to get them, because they do hold people accountable. So what has happened instead in Langley Park is this broader framework around a community development agreement, which is really hard to hold the counties accountable for. The Purple Line Corridor Coalition has started this dashboard because the counties agreed to a set of goals, and so we've assigned a matrix of data to it and are trying to hold the counties accountable through that, but it's not the same as a legal agreement that says you must do this and are liable. So I don't think, I think that community benefits are great if communities can get them, but I would say that we definitely need to do more, because community benefits agreements are usually limited in their scope, in particular, you know, what communities are able to extract out of them, because they are legally binding agreements. So we need both community benefits agreements and more disruptive tactics. I've been inspired in the midst of these uprisings to see some of the things that communities are doing, from chaining themselves to buildings, to disrupting city council meetings, to all of these things that I think are important tactics and strategies to think about extracting more value from a system that's very extractive in communities of color. And I think that people are getting much more creative and bold, and I would like to see that in our profession as well.
Thank you. That's so fun. I'd like to give it back to Bernadette.
So yeah, I think I wanted to ask you a kind of follow-up question to something that came up. And it's really around the sort of politics of some of this and sort of, the immigrant community in particular, and the fact that there's this undocumented immigrant group, and how you see these, this larger kind of politics that's going on at the federal level as having an impact on the ability to organize amongst this particular group within Langley Park, or even elsewhere that you've done your work. How do you see that larger kind of policies kind of affecting things, or the larger kind of politics?
Yeah, well, obviously the politics at the larger federal level are disruptive to many things, not just local communities right now. But, it hits home in communities like Langley Park in particular ways. Around Trump's immigration policies, there was a lot of fear of residents, a lot of increased policing presence of residents. I don't think Prince George's County has a sanctuary policy. There was a lot of politics over whether it would label itself as a sanctuary county. And so there's just been a lot of fear, and it certainly impacts, citizen engagement and participation, and whether people will show up to a meeting, like a meeting about the Purple Line, given the kind of politics and the kind of visible political role that people might play otherwise. And so this sort of heightened sense of fear and precarity that is particularly being dealt to Latinx and immigrant communities in particular has just made it really difficult for communities. Redevelopment is a process that often takes a long time. The Purple Line has been in talks since the 1990s. And we're finally seeing the impacts of it, but you have communities that have so many other problems from COVID to immigration enforcement that are just, to lack of employment, that are just dealing daily blows to this community. And it makes it very difficult to organize, to the question around, what are some of the constraints to organizing, but also just to feel like this is a safe venue for me to participate and to voice my concerns, and that this is a relevant way to sort of spend my time. And the more at the federal level those protections aren't granted, that the rhetoric around immigration and around the illegality of citizens is in question, the more it forces people into the shadows. And that has real implications for planning, for public policy making, and for anti-displacement organizing.
Yeah, I kind of don't want to end on a low note, but hopefully we'll see something different in our future, soon to be election around the corner. So thank you so much, Willow. It's been great to have you here. It's pity you're not here in person, but maybe another time. So I'd just like to thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, and I'm excited to read your book when it comes out. And I also want to thank Yaz Multiama for helping and assisting. And then, of course, Eric Herman, who's here tonight, helping with the technology and also inviting Willow here to this talk. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.